Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. It is time to look at green in Murders at Karlov Manor. Is it just me, or does it seem like everyone mispronounces the name of this set? Anyway, green is my favorite color. So I'm hoping we'll find some good tools for the toolbox among the cards of this set. After this, we're going to finally review multicolor. We always do it last because they are the hardest ones to build your decks around because of the color requirements. Anyway, let's get started. Analyze the pollen. This is a totally playable card. We have similar effects in Standard. There's one that you can cleave with black mana to do a diabolical tutor effect. There's one that can proliferate. Instead of finding a land, there's one that can do a fight instead of finding a land. And this one, if you collect evidence, it can find a creature. This one seems more powerful than those other ones I just listed off. I think we may have found some real power here. 8 is definitely not a small cost, but it's much easier to hit than, like, Delve 8. It doesn't take 8 cards, it just takes 8 mana cost. So, early on you'll be happy to find a land. Just a little bit later in the game, with a little bit of self-mill and setup, you'll be happy to go find exactly the creature you need. Get a leg up. I don't love pump spells for Standard. If this thing gave hexproof, we'd be talking. But otherwise, this would be extremely niche. It'd need to be some kind of a go-wide token deck, and even then, you wouldn't want very many copies, if any. Probably doesn't get there in Standard. Hard-hitting question. This is 1 mana removal, and this could see Standard play. So, it's not a fight, so you don't lose your creature. It's a bite effect. So it just deals damage equal to its power to a creature or planeswalker you don't control. The price is right. It would be absolutely, phenomenal if it was an instant, but even at sorcery speed, being 1 mana, it's the right price. So I guess the hardest hitting question is, can green find its way in this Standard? There are green plus another color decks in Standard. There's been some green-red dinosaurs, there's been green-black mid-range, a few other iterations, but green's been having a hard time for a while. And that is painful because green is my favorite color, both in Magic and in life. But if there is going to be a chance for green to shine, this card could be part of the reason why. It's a great card. Hedge Whisperer. This probably does not see Standard play. I think if its activation was cheaper, in terms of mana, it could have seen Standard play, even as weird as it is. I don't think this gets there for constructed formats. 3 is a lot of toughness for an early drop, so you might be able to block some things in the early game with this. But I don't think this gets there. Pick your poison. Probably not a main deckable card. Could be a sideboard card. 1 green, again, it's a very cheap price to pay if this is what you need. So, if you just want to get some artifacts and enchantments off the board, or your opponent's got a crucial creature with flying, you'd like to be able to make them sacrifice, like Rafine or something. I could see sideboarding this card in best of 3. Probably not a main deck card for best of 1. Rope. The same comments I've had about the other clue equipments are true here. If you want to run this for its clue synergy, right, where you make mana that can only be used on activated abilities, or you run Tezzeret, or you run the new blue rare that makes, abilities of artifacts 1 cheaper. All of those could be good reasons to run a clue equipment, so you can just sacrifice it, draw a card, maybe get it back from the graveyard, do some kind of an eggs strategy. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the original eggs were from Odyssey block, from a deck long, long ago. This one, I will say, is a terrible piece of equipment. Giving reach is actually pretty useful, so there is that, but 3 to equip is harsh. So, this is potentially the worst piece of equipment out of the whole bunch. But if you've got green in your, clue equipment synergy deck, then you could run rope. Just to be sacking it, and once in a great while, you'll use it as equipment. Rubblebelt Maverick. I think this is potentially good enough to see play. So, 1/1 for 1 green, an ETB Surveil 2. So you're finding, what you need, whether it's a land or a spell. You're filling up your graveyard, potentially. And then, when this guy dies, he has additional utility from your graveyard. Which, there are some cards in the set that care about creatures leaving your graveyard. So, he is good with the cards in the set. He's also not bad, generally speaking, with, graveyard synergies, even outside of that. He's alright. Maybe not the most exciting, but definitely smooths out your draws starting on turn 1, and smoothing out the draws and finding the land. Some people underestimate how much that changes the course of a game of Magic. That quality of this card might be one of its strongest selling points. Aftermath Analyst. You get a 1/3 blocker for 2. Not a very offensive play. When it ETBs, you mill 3, and then later you can pay 4, sacrifice this at instant speed, return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. I think this card may just be better than Splendid Reclamation. It gives you a body. It mills. It's only an uncommon and not a rare. I'm a bit flummoxed, actually, by the amount of power creep that I'm seeing here. I think this card's pretty good. If you've got graveyard synergies and land synergies, this very well might do fantastic work for you. Could be part of a combo that wins you the game. Fanatical Strength. Pretty basic combat trick. +3/+3 and trample till end of turn, 2 mana. It's fair but unexciting. Basically sees no standard play. This costing like twice as much as the red instant that effectively gives +3/+1 in trample. That extra point of mana is a big difference. Compared to the 2 toughness that this is gaining, that's not enough bonus compared to the extra mana that this costs. So even in a low-to-the-ground aggro deck, this will do some work for you if you run it, but it's not anywhere close to what a 1-mana trick would be doing. Probably does not get there. Flourishing Bloomkin, I've seen a few people already trying to run this in mono green. Just, play it on 2, and it just gets bigger and bigger as the game goes on. And that's interesting. You don't bother disguising it unless you happen to have all the mana. You just play it as a beater on 2. And if mono green can potentially get somewhere with this thing, that's neat. It's just an uncommon. So you're not out a lot of wild cards for crafting it and trying it. Nervous Gardener, this is good in limited, I think in constructed. It's just too slow. If you want to get lands in your hand, or even lands onto the battlefield, by the time you could have played this face down and then flipped it up, you could have been searching your library for lands and putting them straight onto the battlefield. So I don't think this really sees constructed play. Sharp-Eyed Rookie, this is strong. Alright, so I got a human detective, and that's potentially 2 relevant creature types. 2/2 with vigilance, already, not bad for the mana cost, and whenever a creature ETBs under your control, if its power or its toughness is greater than this card, it gets a +1/+1 counter and you investigate. So, getting bigger, of course, helps to put away the game. Getting the clues helps you recover if there's like board sweepers and other things happening. Unless the board sweepers fare well, then you're going to have all kinds of fuel for the fire to keep going and pushing your creature strategy. I think this card's really good. If green can get its feet under it, this should find a home somewhere in Standard. Tunnel Tipster, this probably won't get there because most of the disguise cards probably won't get there. If they did, if there was a disguise deck, then this card could see play in Standard. If the power of the disguised creatures was good enough to actually be running them, then this card would be mana ramp on 2 that grows as you play, the main strategy of your deck. Unfortunately, the cards that turn this card on are not the most competitive. So I doubt this would be anything more than a casual kind of deck. V2 Ghazi Inspector. We got a 1/3 reach. That's an okay blocker. It's, no one would ever run it just for that. If you could reliably collect evidence 6, though, you put a +1 counter on a creature and you gain 2 life. So the floor on this card is if you have no other creatures in play, this becomes a 2/4 reach that gained you 2 life when it ETB'd. And that is a heck of a roadblock for aggro. 2/4 on 2 mana and gain 2 life. That's setting up a big stop sign, telling the opponent to slow down. Now, the trouble is being able to reliably collect evidence 6. That seems hard to set up. From turn 1 going into turn 2. Probably very doable by turn 3. You could cycle the Panther that's in this set and you would have it by turn 3. There might be some other ways to do it in Standard, but if you could do it, I think it would be playable. But it seems so hard to set up that it's difficult to imagine. Airtight Alibi, we've had other cards like this in Standard. I think there was one for Werewolves. There's been some other kind of similar auras from time to time. Now, this one does do the hexproof thing, but 3 mana is way too much for a combat trick, even one that gives hexproof. And I like that it untaps it. I like that it can remove Suspicion. That has a little bit of interesting play, but really I don't think this is what you're looking for. Archdruid's Charm. So, 3 green is a big ask. That's not to say you can't do it in a multicolor deck. People ran Invoke Despair, which had 4 black pips, in 3 color decks and more, all the time. So there are ways to make your mana base such that you could play this even in a 3, 4, 5 color deck. So the question is it good enough? The first mode, you get to tutor for a creature or land. If it's a land, it goes on the battlefield tapped. And if it's a creature, you put it in your hand. Being an instant is interesting. You get to set this up at the end of the opponent's turn, and then you either find the mana that you need or the next play that you need. Mode 2. You put a counter on a creature you control, and then it does a bite effect. Deals damage equal to its power to a creature you don't control. Unfortunately, that mode doesn't hit planeswalkers. But still, that's really nice to have at instant speed as one of the options. And the third one, exile an artifact or enchantment. That's nice utility. You know, 3 green is a little pricey for the effect, but it's extra text on the card that you just have access to. It's just more utility at your disposal. And that's great. It's also great that it exiles. Maybe you don't ever want to see their Portal to Phyrexia again, so just get rid of that one. It's gone. I think if mono green can be a thing, then Archdruid's Charm can be a thing. It's a very flexible card. The instant speed does a world of good for it. So, yeah, I think this card is playable. The only question is if mono green is playable. Audience with Trostani. So, the floor on this card is actually surprisingly not awful. That probably sounds weird for any of you out there hearing this. But you get a chump blocker and you draw a card, and you know, if this costs 2 mana, probably everyone would run it. At least anyone who's doing a controlling kind of deck. Because then there would be times where you could also draw more than 1 card off of it, but the floor would be pretty good at 2 mana. At 3 mana, it's a little bit more questionable. But I run cards in a 250 card white mid-range control deck. You know, like the dog that draws you a card, the double strike prototype for 3 that draws you a card, the 2/1 angel that gains you a life and draws you a card. And this is just a little bit behind those on its floor. The ceiling, obviously, is much higher if you have differently named creature tokens. Now, all that being said, I don't think you run this card without, you know, making a deck for it. I think this is a build-around rare where you do want differently named tokens. You want to make sure you're getting that part of this card. Which means it's not really a tool for the toolbox, but it's not that far off from being like a playable filler card in like a giant pile deck like I just described. Where you're basically just cycling, getting some chump blockers, and trying to dig your way through, you know, this massive deck that you've created to find the cards you really want. And sometimes it'll draw you more than 1 card. Yes, I'm silly. But even though I don't recommend you craft it, I think it's not as bad as it looks. Case of the Trampled Garden. This one is almost interesting for trying to do in Constructed. I think it's not quite good enough, but it's not too hard to solve. It does immediately impact the board the turn you play it, so it kind of acts like a 2-2 with haste, except it's making a creature gigantic that might attack that turn, which it has more value than just a 2-2 would have, right? If you turn something else into like a 4-5 suddenly. And then in the solved state, you always get a +1 counter, and something gains trample whenever you attack. And that's pretty good. So if this card isn't good enough to see play, then it's just by a narrow margin. It might be. It might be worth trying. Pompous Gadabout. This is fun in Limited. I think it doesn't really have a strong role in Constructed. Having hexproof on your turn does mean that the opponent can't instant speed remove it. They have to tap mana on their turn to kill this thing. That's a little interesting, but not interesting enough. Sample Collector. So the first time this attacks, it is a 3/4, as long as you can collect evidence 3. That's okay, but we actually have a lot of really good 3/4s for 3 in green. Now this one's an uncommon, so, bear that in mind. But you also don't have to jump through a lot of hoops for those other 3/4s for 3. In fact, some of them will just produce value for you. Making map tokens and having vigilance and exiling cards from graveyards and making your spells cheaper, all kinds of stuff. Now this one keeps growing. It doesn't even have to grow itself, you can put the counter somewhere else. But I guess I'm saying there are better options. This is an interesting budget option, though. Slime Against Humanity. Talk about a budget deck. Fill up a deck with 25, 30 copies of this and a few other things for the early game and knock yourself out. It would be great if you could somehow, cascade this. Give it the ability to, cast more copies of itself. And maybe you can engineer a little bit of that with the deck, There's the red card. The Geologist, 2 red, 2 colorless, that casts a spell when he enters the battlefield that's 3 mana or less. Might play pretty well into a Slime Against Humanity deck, because that's probably what you're going to hit. There are ways you can play into the synergies here. But it's not that amazing. On the other hand, it also doesn't cost you that much in terms of wildcards. Give it a shot. They went this way. There are a lot of options for how to mana ramp in Standard. This is one. Gives you 2 cards in the long run. One of them is a land, and one of them is a clue that you have to crack. Whether or not you want this one depends on what you need for your deck. Some spells like this make little 1/1s, chump blockers and stuff, and that might be more valuable with our aggressive metagame. Or they might be scalable. Right? There's a card from Aftermath that costs 2 green and X. And you can either play it in a 2-player game for X is 1 or X is 2. So, where this always gets you 1 land and a clue, that one could get you 1 land on 3 or 2 lands on 4. There are a lot of different ways to parse out what kind of ramp spell you want for your deck. This is not a bad tool, it's just a common. But I don't know that it beats out some of the other options we have. There's also a great one with Flashback from Innistrad. We flash it back for 5. Now you don't do that most of the time unless you have gotten up into the late game of a ramp deck, but then once you got 5 mana laying around, yeah, get another mana. It's what your deck needs. All the mana you can get. So I'm saying there's a lot of competition here, but this one could have a home. Undergrowth Recon. I like this card. It's a touch narrow because it doesn't just slot into any deck. But there are multiple ways to build a deck that cares about lands and the graveyard and lands coming back from the graveyard. Or you could go green-blue and have Slowgurk. Or Soul of Windgrace. And like Riveteers, Jund colors. This is another one that cares about lands and the graveyard and all of that interaction. And you can do a pretty compelling case for mono green. Doing like a build around Titania. Cards like that love lands going to the graveyard. She gains you extra life when that's happening. If you're using the New Capenna sack lands, then that's gaining you 3 life with Titania, like every upkeep. And just, thinning out your deck and accelerating your mana. It's a neat card, it's a little slow. And whether or not, messing around with lands in the graveyard sounds like your kind of thing, probably determines whether or not you want to experiment with this one. Axebane Ferox. So Death Touch and Haste is good. This means that it doesn't care if it runs into Shouldered. It'll kill her. Not kill each other, but it'll kill her. Trades with just about anything it tangles with, as long as it doesn't have First Strike and Death Touch. It's also a little hard to mess with because it has Ward, Collect Evidence 4. Now, if your opponent doesn't care about their graveyard, and they've been playing a lot of instants and sorceries, then yeah, they can probably target this thing. But a lot of people in Standard do care about their graveyard. Or if they don't care about their graveyard, they might not have filled it up with anything. So it's a neat ward cost on this. And it's a neat hasty beater. Now, it's got competition. There are other cards in Standard, in red and green both, that are like 4/4s with haste for 4 with various effects. I like the Death Touch here, but I don't know if you need to run out and craft this one. Bite Down on Crime. Plays well in Limited, but 4 mana is way too much for constructed play. The Collect Evidence 6 gets it down to 2 mana, but it's still not that impressive of a card. It also doesn't hit Planeswalkers. So I don't think this really has a home in Constructed. Case of the Locked Hothouse. This is neat. So it might seem a little slow, but if you're playing things like the New Capenna lands that are gaining you life, then you could be feeding into this card in a nice way. There's also some cards that let you play lands from your graveyard that we have in Standard. This right here is one of my favorites. It's such a forgotten gem. I never see anyone running this on the ladder. It's one of my best cards for a green deck. So, it's a 4-mana artifact that might seem a little steep, but, if this is turn 5, then you can play this and make sure you hit your land drop out of the graveyard, which could be one of those New Capenna fetches. And the interesting thing about this one is a lot of those cards, you know, like the 3/4 Angel lets you play lands and things from the graveyard, is when those lands go away again, they exile. Not true with this one. You can play that same Streets of New Capenna fetch every single turn out of the graveyard over and over and over again, and you'll never need another land. You can just keep playing that same land. This can also let you play a spell out of the graveyard. You can only do that once a turn, and it's at the cost of playing any other spell for the turn. But if you've got something valuable down in the graveyard, like a Titan of Industry, you might not need any other spells for the turn. So why did I bring all of that up here? Because Case of the Locked Hothouse combos really well with what I just mentioned there. Every Case of the Locked Hothouse means you can play that New Capenna fetch out of the graveyard another time. Gain another life. Then your deck another step. Ramp another mana for your next turn. Or, if you've got the card that references caves, where lands come into play untapped, all those lands could be coming in the same turn, untapped, ready to use. I know that's all a lot of setup, but you could be gaining life at the same time that you're doing this, and with that much mana, you should be able to find a way to stabilize and somehow win the game. But the first mode on the card is not the only thing it does. It solves when you control 7 or more lands. That's not hard to do in green. And then you can look at the top card of your library anytime. You may play lands and cast creature and enchantment spells from the top of your library. That's good. That's strong. You can play additional copies of itself, notably, so you don't get stuck on another Case of the Locked Hothouse. This seems pretty good. I could definitely see a deck for it, but I don't think it goes in a wide variety of decks. So, I don't know that it's a toolbox card. It's neat, though. Chalk Outline, this one is not widely applicable to a whole lot of different decks. This one is a build-around. Now, it's nice that it's an uncommon, so you're not out a lot of wild cards. But it's definitely a build-around. You need to be engineering a way to have creature cards leave your graveyard. Preferably, you could do this at instant speed. So, you can make token detectives to suddenly appear and block, come in at the end of your opponent's turn after they've already done a board sweeper, stuff like that. Greenbelt Radical, this is a disguise creature. Does a little mini overrun effect when it's flipped up, which is not completely inconsiderable, but it's so much mana. This just turns into a 5/5 trampler that turn, which is not much for your investment of 7 mana, plus having played it as a morph earlier. There are other ways to get overrun effects in green that are stronger, and there are creatures that would be much, much stronger in the meantime than playing this card either face up or face down. So, I don't think this does it for Constructed. Hide in Plain Sight. If this had been an instant, it would for sure have been a great card. As a sorcery, it's a maybe. So you look at the top 5 cards of your library, you cloak 2 of them, which don't have to be creatures. Right? You could cloak lands, and sorceries, and whatever. And put the rest on the bottom in a random order. It's more helpful if they are creatures, because you can flip them face up later for its mana cost. And it can make things like the Greenbelt Radical flip up for a lot less mana. Right? In that case, the Radical would flip up for 4. And then it'd be, do its overrun effect with the counter and all of that for 3 less mana. That would be pretty good. Still probably not good enough, but this card is interesting. The sorcery speed really hurts, though. And it only puts out like a reasonable amount of power and toughness to start with. Not like a really compelling amount. Or if this had made, 3 tokens, this would have been amazing. Or if this had been an instant speed. Also probably pretty amazing there too. As it is, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that this does anything. It's not terrible, though. The Eavesdropper, this is a limited card. It's nice that it makes a clue. Nice that it can get bigger when you draw your second card and get Vigilance. None of that makes it constructed playable. A Killer Among Us. So, it does make 3 tokens. And it can make one of those tokens a 4/4 when it attacks. Gains Death Touch the turn that it attacks. So, in a roundabout way, this can put out 6 power and toughness on 3 bodies. Requires you to be aggressive in order to do that, but you can chump block with one of the ones you didn't name. I don't think this quite gets there. Don't think it quite does it for constructed, but it's a cute card. Culvered Ambusher. Costs too much mana. It is interesting that you can get its effect when it enters the battlefield, so you could just play it as a 4/5, and a creature would have to block this turn if able. But if you want to block, if you want that thing to block a specific creature of yours, then you have to attack with only one thing. Because all you're forcing it to do is block. You didn't say what it has to block. I don't think it's good enough for constructed. Vengeful Creeper, again, it's too expensive for constructed play. It's a useful effect, but way too expensive. Topiary Panther is a maybe. The basic land cycling on this card could give it a home somewhere. There's already a 7-mana sorcery in the Domain deck that cycles for land and gains you 3 life. So I don't know if this makes it into most decks. It's a great budget option, though. So if you don't want to craft a rare to have that effect in your deck, you could just get the Panther. And it does put this giant plant cat into your graveyard. Maybe you can regrow it later. Maybe you can reanimate it later. Maybe you'll collect evidence from it. It seems like it could have uses. Glint Weaver, this is a card that's a little bit familiar. The last few years in Standard, very often there's been some kind of a giant reach creature for about 7 mana at the uncommon slot. Gains you life, has reach, maybe does something else. They keep making different iterations of this kind of card. So this one comes in with an ETB trigger that distributes 3 counters, and then you gain the life equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control. That could be a little interesting because we have a 15 toughness creature in Standard. But I still don't think this card's probably worth it. Oh, speaking of that 15 toughness creature, here it is. The Pride of Hulklade. 11 mana, but it costs X less to cast, where X is the total toughness of creatures you control. It's actually not that hard to get this down to a very reasonable mana cost, or even just 1. For that 1 mana, you get a 2/15 Defender. That is enough toughness that the only way they're going to kill this, even with pump effects and such, is if it's a double striker. You know, the kind of thing that was going to take you from 20 to 0 might be able to punch up to the Pride of the Hulklade. Most other things this is going to be able to block. And it's got an activated ability of 2 blue, 2 colorless. Until end of turn, a creature you control gets +1 power, and it gains whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw cards equal to its toughness. And it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. Notably, you do not have to target something with Defender. You can target anything. And obviously, if it targets itself and it gets through, you'd draw 15 cards. Which is kind of dumb. There are a couple ways in Standard to give you no maximum hand size. So if you want to do that, you could try to go for it. Another interesting way this could play is there's a black creature from back in Innistrad. It's a 3 mana, 1/5, and then if you have at least 3 creatures with more toughness than power at the beginning of combat, it flips into a 2/6, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 3, tap, sacrifice another creature, and the opponent loses life equal to that thing's toughness. So you could throw the Pride of the Hulklade at the opponent to deal 15 to them. There's also cards that cause creatures to deal damage equal to their toughness. Now, there was a turtle just recently, or back in Innistrad, there was a tree folk. So, there could be a deck for this card, but it's not widely applicable into a lot of decks. It's a build-around. Rakish Scoundrel could be played in mono green, you know, as disguise and flip, but it's way too much mana. Riftburst Hellion, there's just nothing that special about this card that green can't already do, and do it better. Crowd Control Warden is a little bit interesting. If you have a go wide strategy, then you can flip this up in a green deck, and it would be enormous. And then if you give it Trample, yeah, it could possibly just win the game for you. There probably are still better and cheaper ways to do it, but it's not inconceivable that this could win the game for you. Crocodile's just too expensive. Even though it investigates when it deals combat damage to a player, the things you can do for, 5, 6, 7 mana in green are so much better than this. Alright, Bustle. We've got an Overrun effect. Creatures you control get +2/+2 and trample until end of turn, and you can turn a creature you control face up. This would be alright. As a win con in green, if you have access to cards like the completed Nissa, she's a planeswalker, she only costs 1 more mana than this, and you can pay life to play her for less. She just doesn't do her overrun effect immediately, if you play her for less than 7. She does +1/+1 for each forest you control. And trample. Now this is just an uncommon, but I think there are a lot of ways in green to get similar effects. So this one's not that impressive. Green can do both sides of cease and desist. So you can exile 2 cards from a graveyard. You gain 2 life, draw a card. So it's just a little bit of utility. You can kind of cycle it, hate on the opponent's graveyard a little bit. Maybe hit a life gain synergy. Or there's Desist. Desist is actually pretty powerful. It's not going to affect every deck equally. Some decks are going to be, really creature focused, and Desist won't do much there, and you'll just play the Cease side of the card. But Desist is an absolute wrecking ball. For for decks like the enchantment deck or a number of different artifact decks that exist in Standard. Desist can also trip up some decks that you might not expect. Right, like if you think about the Domain deck, you know, it uses the Flash Leyline to exile things. Sometimes it also uses Ossification to exile things. If you suddenly cast Desist and you're getting the ETB triggers of things like, you know, Titan of Industry and stuff that you've been playing out and they've been removing over the course of the game, that could be backbreaking for the opponent. So, I don't know how many copies of this card you would run in a green deck. Probably not too many. But Desist could be a real surprise to an opponent who's not expecting it. Green can play the Flotsam side of Flotsam and Jetsam. Just an instant that mills 3 cards and investigates. Green has better ways of milling itself. Just straight up, I'll tell you. Alright, that brings us to the end of green. So let me pick out some things that I want to craft here. Sharp-Eyed Rookie seems like an all-around great card. So if you're doing more of a green mid-range kind of a deck, you know, just a beatdown plan, this is a card that will pay you back for doing what you were already doing. And even if the opponent sweeps the board, as long as it wasn't Farewell specifically, then you're going to be left with a bunch of clues to refill your hand and start all over again. I think this card's going to be fantastic. Case of the Locked Hothouse, I'm excited to build some combos around this card. You know, play the same land out of my graveyard 5 times in one turn. Sounds like fun. So this might be more of a personal choice for me, and less of a, you know, general purpose card. You don't have to follow me on all my crafts. Analyze the Pollen, what's not to love? You can just get a land for 1 mana, or you can sometimes get a creature for 1 mana. The price is right. It's just sometimes you won't have the evidence. But even then, it's still a pretty serviceable card. I like it. Normally I would craft a Mythic here, but I've already got a playset of Undergrowth Recon. And I don't know that I need my 4th copy of the Pride of Holclade, so I'm actually going to save this Mythic and I'm going to spend it when I get to multicolor. Alright, let's do this thing. So join me next time, we'll do multicolor, and that'll finish out the deck building toolbox for Murders at Karlov Manor. And until then, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.